afternoon and welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In continuation with the series on sociology of India, in today's lecture we are going to talk about agrarian social structure with specific reference to India. Now it's very important to first understand why do we need to study agrarian social structure, and also in terms of understanding what is agrarian social structure, how it has been undergoing changes, and what has been the dynamics of agrarian social structure in India. So let us start off with the basic question, why study agrarian social structure? And this to answer, we'll try to understand that much of the population, specifically in India and other parts of the world, survive on agriculture. And it was from agricultural source of livelihood that people started moving and setting up in cities, and urban kind of setup started. So the idea is to understand the basic social structure in rural area, and most of the time it has been studied by the rural sociologists, but there has been a kind of neglect in terms of focusing more on urbanization, industrialization, and agrarian sociology or rural sociology has kind of received less attention. So let us begin with the idea of what is kind of importance of understanding the social life of the agrarian or the rural society. The first requirement is to understand that it is related to land, and land is one of the principal source of people's livelihood. So a majority of us are going to be dependent on the livelihood through the land. Second, it's related to the producer, the peasants who form the major section of the population. And it's important to kind of draw attention to the social life of the producer, or those who are kind of producing for the rest of the population. The third, agriculture with its technology and method is also involved, which is genesis of human civilization. And fourth, it involves the social relationship between the producer and the consumer. Ultimately, the linkage between the rural and the urban, the whole understanding of how urban life started, evolved, the issue of migration, the issue of inequality are understood only when we try to understand how there has been a tendency towards marketization, towards commercialization of agriculture. So let us now understand what we mean by the two terms agrarian and structure. Agrarian, we can explain it in different ways. One is to understand agrarian with reference to something which is cultivated or agricultural land. So when agrarian comes into our mind, the first thing comes in is that it is something which is related to agricultural land. Second, it is related or connected with landed property. So they would be people who would be kind of having hold over landed property. So the jamindars, the landlords. And the third is how the cultivated land is managed or distributed. So the social relationship between the owners of these land, the cultivators, the tenants, sharecroppers would fall a nexus of trying to understand what is agrarian. Now when we try to understand what is structure, a structure denotes articulation of a set of products which are mutually distinct but are also interrelated to form a whole. So one part or a whole has different unit. Now the structure implies that each of these units are connected to each other, and the understanding of each part in a set would enable us to understand the structure. Now, agrarian structure denotes the mutual relationship between different social groups. We just talked about the groups like land owners, jamindars, those who have ownership of land, the cultivators, the tenant. So there is a number of groups which are connected to the land, and the social relationship between them engaged in the process of production, consumption and distribution would together form the agrarian structure. So the agrarian structure denotes a framework of social relationship in which all agricultural activities such as production, marketing and consumptions are carried out. So there is a commonsensical understanding that agrarian refers only to production and land implies only production. But that's kind of limited. We need to understand everything that right from the owner getting hold of the land to the sowing of seeds to the cultivation of the product to marketing to reaching to the consumer would kind of help us understand agrarian structure. So the institution of the framework of social relationship, because it is social structure, the emphasis is on social relationship, and this determines how and by whom land is cultivated, what kind of crops can be produced and for what purpose, how food and agricultural incomes can be distributed, and in what way or in what terms the agrarian sector is linked to the rest of the economy or society. And this brings out to the significance of understanding agrarian social structure. So we have understood what we mean by agrarian structure. Now this next thing that we need to understand is what constitutes agrarian structure. So by now we have understood that agrarian societies are those settlements and groupings of people who earn their livelihood primarily by cultivating land and by carrying related activities to the whole process of agriculture, for instance, animal husbandry. The main economic activity which we can understand with reference to agrarian structure is obviously agricultural production or cultivation of the product. But now we are not only looking into the physical or the ecological conditions required for production of a particular crop. What is important is to look into the people who are involved in that production and how that social relations are negotiated, whether the relations is an egalitarian relation or it is based on inequality and exploitation. So it is a complex structure. It's a complex social relationship between landowner, tillers, tenant, sharecropper and wage laborer. So that we will see when we understand change that it has shifted from say having a share in the product to now employing wage labor in agricultural activity as well. So one of the social relationship which becomes significant when we understand agrarian structure in India is the Jajmani system. Now the Jajmani system, which is a patron-client relationship, was kind of looking into the entire production process in which there was exchange of goods. There was no kind of wage, but it would be labor would be exchanged with certain kinds of good produced in a particular area. Now, when we have understood what constitute agrarian structure, the most important thing is to understand that in sociology, there has been studies by a number of anthropologists and sociologists. So, one of these significant study is by Andre Bethe. Now, Andre Bethe says that the study of agrarian structure revolves around two important issues. One is technological arrangement, and number two is social arrangement. Now technological arrangement, we know that we have now kind of used technology to manage land. It could include how we are kind of employing technology for our land ownership, control and use of land. So it kind of also vary with the variation in ecological conditions. So the technological application would be fruitful only if it is kind of supported by the ecological conditions. So ecological condition is in terms of looking at the geography which surrounds it. So the diverse nature of ecological condition has been described by Bethe as there are areas of heavy rainfall and areas with hardly any rainfall. So this is the wide diversity in terms of the geographical conditions which would be enabling to understand the way in which agricultural production take place. So there is kind of complete contrast, heavy rainfall to no rainfall, irrigated to unirrigated areas. Irrigated areas also vary in terms of the dependent on the irrigation. So the different regions showed different patterns of seasonal variation in terms of the humidity, temperature and sunlight. So we need to look into around, even if we are trying to understand the social relation, technology, ecology becomes important. So it's embedded. It's not that it's going to be separated and each studied differently, but they need to be understood. Now next we try to understand that when we think about the agrarian social structure, most of the time in literature, in social science, it has been understood with reference to 4 ideas. First is the peasant society. So this is kind of considered as more or less synonymous. The second is that agrarian society are feudal. So feudalism was considered as one of the salient feature of agrarian social structure. And the third is in terms of contemporary agrarian system, which where with the coming in of technology, with the coming in of the market, the commercialization of land, we have the capitalist system in which the agrarian structure would then be based on class. So it kind of shift from a collective consumption based activity to a market oriented profit based activity, and therefore it also helps us to understand the marketization of the agriculture. So first we need to understand the idea of the peasant society. It was developed during the post-war period in the Western society. Now the peasants were seen to have emerged after the disintegration of tribal form of social and economic life and agriculture as the means of livelihood. So it was again a part of the evolutionary theory where the society was moving from say herding and wandering around to settled agricultural life, and therefore people who settled in a particular area of and took up agricultural as the means of life were described as peasant. Now the second or the third stage of evolution would be the agricultural settled life started changing with the coming in of industrialization. So there were people who could have then moved to industries to look into for paid jobs and work in the industry rather than working on the agricultural field. This was again kind of put into the framework that industrial society was considered as more progressive and developed. So in order to progress, one had to give up agricultural and move to industry. This also led to the increase in migration, large scale migration and setting up of urban areas next to the industries. So in anthropology, the peasant society was described as homogeneous, undifferentiated social formation. So within social sciences, again we were next to the evolutionary paradigm was the comparative method, where there was a kind of comparing one type of society to the other, and the most prevalent framework was to compare Western society with the non-Western society or the less developed society, simple society with complex industrial society. So the peasant society was put into the category of simple society, and they were kind of considered as homogeneous. Homogeneous in the sense that everybody were kind of doing the same kind of occupation. The social life was less differentiated, and therefore it was kind of different from the industrial society where there were people from different regions, from different background, and therefore the industrial society was described as heterogeneous with the formation of class and lot of differentiation and inequality emerging at the same time. Peasantry was placed between primitive communities on one side and the modern entrepreneurs on the other. The peasant society lacked class formation. So this evolved from primitive communism, which was kind of based on community life, collective subsistence economy. Then you start have the settled agricultural activity, and then people move to industries, set up their own entrepreneurs, modern entrepreneurs. So with the modern entrepreneurs coming in, class formation starts. So class formation was kind of considered as absent in the peasantry. So but if we compare it with the primitive communism, some amount of surplus production started taking place in the peasantry, and that is why it would then go away to the capitalist formation. Robert Redfield argued that the peasantry was a universal human type. Now, his understanding was based on the nature of the peasantry in the Western society. So, peasants were attached to land through bonds of sentiment and emotion. It is here, this feature of the peasantry as attached to land and to sentiment was something which was kind of taken and used for understanding agrarian society in India, where the idea was that people were attached to their land and therefore the land was kind of source of sentiment and emotions. Now, this explanation of the peasantry was kind of also considered as an ideal type, and this idea of peasantry as an ideal type was developed by Theodore Sanin. Now, ideal type means it was only in the minds of the anthropologist and sociologist and not necessarily found as a kind something as universally. So, Sanin defined peasant as small agricultural producer who, with the help of simple equipment and the labor of their family, produced mostly for their own consumption. So, we already said that the idea was that agriculture is the means of livelihood. The production is not for the market. Whatever is produced was consumed by the community. It was for self-consumption, and therefore it was a simple homogeneous society. Sahanin identified four interdependent facets of peasant society. Number one, peasant family works as the multi-dimensional unit of social organization. That means they were not hiring workers from outside. All the labor was carried out by different members of the society. So, it was a collective labor and they were kind of doing different kind. There was kind of not very strict division of labor in terms of skills and specialities, but in kind of distributed among the members of the family. The second, the family land husbandry works as the main means of livelihood. So, you don't have by this point of time any kind of other non-agricultural activity. So, all the members of the family, and this would be large, composition of this family would be large, they would be indulged in the agricultural as their means of livelihood, and the level of technology being used was very low. Third, peasant society followed specific cultural pattern linked to the way of life of a small rural community. So, there was not much differentiation in the social life of the people. They had kind of a very structured cultural pattern of life. The fourth, domination over peasantry by outsider. Now, once there was a kind of integration of the peasant society with outsider, the peasants were kind of identified as inferior, underdeveloped, and therefore the outside external group started dominating it. Sahanin argues that the political subjugation interlinks with the cultural subordination and economic exploitation. Now, we are trying to understand agrarian social structure, and the idea is of peasantry. Now, the first thing that we need to understand the idea of the ideal type of a peasant society as a homogeneous society. So, were peasant homogeneous? The ideal conception emerged from the specific experience of the European society. So, it was very historical specific, and the literature being produced in different parts of the world was trying to show that agrarian society were not as autonomous as they were made out to be. So, it was only specific to the particular historical context and not necessarily true in other parts of the world. Agrarian societies were found to be internally differentiated in different strata. For instance, in India, the rural society, which was also agricultural society, was divided between different caste groups, and in Europe, the serfdom dominated the peasantry. So, inequality was inherent in the peasant social structure. So, we cannot kind of just use the ideal type of peasants for understanding agrarian social structure. The second idea of the agrarian social structure is to kind of have an understanding of the feudal society. The feudal society evolved in parts of Europe after the tribal groups settled down and became regular cultivators. So, the industrial revolution of the 18th and 19th century led to disintegration of feudal society and the emergence of modern capitalist economy. So if we follow Karl Marx's evolutionary pattern, primitive communism to feudal society to capitalism was the way in which he described the historical evolution of the society. In the feudal society, the cultivators were seen as subordinate class as they did not legally own the land they cultivated. They only had the right to cultivate the land, whose legal owners were generally the overlord or the feudal lord. So the feudal lord compared to the peasant society is more based on inequality and more of exploitation and kind of a hierarchy. The feudal structure was marked by a relationship of dependency and patronage between the cultivator and the overlord. The cultivating peasant had to show a sense of loyalty and obligation towards their overlords. Loyalty was expressed not only by paying a share of the produce of land to the landlord, but the peasants were also obliged to work for the overlord and perform duties without expecting any wage in return. So that is a second idea of understanding agrarian society. The third is to understand contemporary agrarian society. So we know by 20th century, industrialization and economic development brought about significant change in the agrarian structure. What were these changes? Number one, agriculture lost its significance and became a marginal sector of the economy. So there was a kind of, again, a hierarchy in terms of the nature of employment. The industrial employment was considered as more prosperous and therefore having better terms of employment. So people left the agricultural means of livelihood and shifted to industrial. So only those who were not able to get observed in the industrial were left out. So it was on the marginal and even the decline in the national income declined. Number two, there was a change in the internal social organization. So feudalism and peasant society were now considered as something that was of past and was kind of getting more differentiated. So we kind of look in terms of inequality from primitive communism to say capitalist. The distance between those who were able to have power, economic power, political power and a better position in the society were kind of getting reduced, and there was a larger mass who became dependent on the so-called capitalist class. So what led to the process of industrialization was the modernization of agriculture. So once capitalism comes in, and there is a kind of a hierarchy between agricultural as a means of employment and industry, the tendency was to improve the agricultural outcome, and therefore new technology, farm technology, chemical fertilizers and were used in order to increase the productivity of land. This was made possible for the cultivating farmer to produce much more than the consumption for their self. So from subsistence consumption, it started being produced for the market. So surplus came in. Whatever was over and above the requirement of the was to be sold in the market, and what the surplus that was earned was kind of enjoyed by a particular class. Mechanization of agriculture led to integration of agriculture in the broader market economy of the nation and the world. The social relation of production transformed, leading to the development of capitalist class. So a number of scholars have studied about the idea of modernization of agriculture. What modernization of agriculture besides bringing technology, besides kind of bringing fertilizers and high yielding seeds, led to the change in the social structure. The social structure, agrarian social structure, kind of emerged in terms of having a class structure, and class became significant for understanding the agrarian structure, and a number of scholars have studied agrarian class structure. One of the classical study is by Daniel Thorner. Daniel Thorner looks into the class structure formation in the agrarian structure by looking into three categories. One, income obtained from land, that is through rent, one's own cultivation or wage. Number two, the nature of right, that is whether you own the land or you have a tenancy right or a sharecropper right. Third, the extent of field work actually performed. And on the basis of this, he kind of gives us the three category or three class in agrarian structure. The Malik or landlord, those who owned land, the Kisan or working peasant, those who worked on the plots, and the Mazdoor, who were the wage labor. So we see through the discussion of the agrarian social structure that the relations, agrarian social relations, have undergone change, and it is significant to kind of bring back agrarian sociology in order to have a holistic understanding of economic development in India. With this, I come to an end of this lecture. Thank you.